Being no one. The Self-Model Theory of Subjectivity. Chapter 2, 2.2.1. Introspectibility as attentional availability. Mental states are all those states which can in principle become available for introspection. All states that are available, and particularly those that are actually being introspected, are phenomenal states. This means that they can become objects of a voluntarily initiated and goal-directed process of internal attention. See also section 6.4.3. Mental states possess a certain functional property. They are attentionally accessible. Another way of putting this is by saying that mental states are introspectively penetrable. Voluntarily, at this stage, only means that the process of introspection is itself typically being accompanied by a particular higher order type of phenomenal content, namely a subjectively experienced quality of agency. See sections 6.4.3, 6.4.4, and 6.4.5. This quality is what German philosopher, psychiatrist, and theologian Karl Jaspers calls Vollzugbewusstsein, quote unquote, executive consciousness, the untranscendable experience of the fact that the initiation, the directedness, and the constant sustaining of attention is an inner kind of action, an activity that is steered by the phenomenal subject itself. However, internal attention must not be interpreted as the activity of a homunculus directing the beam of a flashlight consisting of his already existing consciousness toward different internal objects and thereby transforming them into phenomenal individuals. Rather, introspection is a subpersonal process of representational resource allocation, taking space in some information processing systems. It is a special variant of exactly the same processes that forms the topic of our current concept formation. Introspection is the internal, footnote number 15, representation of active mental representata. Footnote. It only is an internal representational process, but not a mental representational process, because even in standard situations, it does not possess the potential to become a content of consciousness itself. For example, through a higher order process of mental representation. Outside of the information processing approach, related ideas are discussed by David Rosenthal in his higher order thought theory. End of footnote. Introspection is meta-representation. Obviously, the interesting class of representata are marked out by being operated on by a sub-symbolic, non-conceptual form of meta-representation, which turns them into the content of higher-order representata. At this stage, quote-unquote sub-symbolic for introspective processing means, quote, using a non-linguistic format, end quote, and, quote, not approximating syntacticity, end quote. A more precise demarcation of this class is an empirical matter, about which hope for epistemic progress in the near future is justified. Those functional properties which transform some internal representata into potential representanda of global mental representational processes, and thereby into introspective states, it can be safely assumed, will be described in a more precise manner by future computational neuroscientists. It may be some time before we discover the actual algorithm, but let me give an example of a simple, coarse-grained, functional analysis, making it possible to research the neural correlates of introspection. Attention is a process that episodically increases the capacity for information processing in a certain partition of representational space. Functionally speaking, attention is internal resource allocation. Attention, as it were, is a representational type of zooming in, serving for a local elevation of resolution and richness in detail within an overall representation. If this is true, phenomenal representata are those structures which, independently of their causal history, that is, independently if they are primarily transporting visual, auditory, or cognitive content, are currently making the information they represent available for operations of this type. Availability for introspection in this sense is a characteristic feature of conscious information processing, and it reappears on the phenomenological level of description. Sometimes, for purely pragmatic reasons, we're interested in endowing internal states with precisely this property. Many forms of psychotherapy attempt to transform pathological mental structures into introspectable states by a variety of different methods. They do so because they work under a very strong assumption, which is usually not justified in any theoretical or argumentative way. This assumption amounts to the idea that pathological structures can, simply by gaining the property of introspective availability, be dissolved, transformed, or influenced in their undesirable effects on the subjective experience of the patient by a magical and never explained kind of quote unquote top down causation. However theoretically naive as many such approaches are, there may be more than a grain of truth in the overall idea. By introspectively attending to quote unquote conflict generating, i.e., functionally incoherent, parts of one's internal self representation, additional processing resources are automatically allocated to this part and may thereby support a positive, i.e., integrative, development. We all use different variants of introspection in non therapeutic, everyday situations when trying to enjoy our sexual arousal, when concentrating, when trying to remember something important, when trying to find out what it really is that we desire, or simply when we are asked how we are today. Furthermore, there are passive, not goal but process oriented types of introspection like daydreaming or different types of meditation. The interesting feature of this subclass of states is that it lacks the executive consciousness mentioned above. The wandering or heightening of attention in these phenomenological state classes seems to take place in a spontaneous manner, not involving subjective agency. There is no necessary connection between personal level agency and introspection in terms of low level attention. What is common to all the states of phenomenal consciousness just mentioned is the fact that the representational content of already active mental states has been turned into the object of inner attention. Footnote 16. There are forms of phenomenal experience, for instance, the states of infants, dreamers, or certain types of intoxication, in which the criterion of quote unquote attentional availability is in principle not fulfilled because something like controllable attention does not exist in these states. However, please recall that at this level of our investigation, the intended class of systems is only formed by adult human beings in non pathological waking states. This is the reason why I do not yet offer an answer to the question of whether attentional availability really constitutes a necessary condition in the ascription of phenomenal states at this point. See also section 6.4.3. The, and footnote, the introspective availability of these states is being utilized in order to episodically move them into the focus of subjective experience. Phenomenal experience possesses a variable focus. By moving this focus, the amount of extractable information can episodically be maximized. See also section 6.5. Now we can already start to see how availability for introspective attention marks out conscious processing. Representational content active in our brains, but principally unavailable for attention, will never be conscious content. Before we can proceed to take a closer look at the second and third sub-constraints, availability for cognition and availability for behavioral control, we need to take a quick detour. The problem is this: what does it actually mean to speak about introspection? Introspection seems to be a necessary phenomenological constraint in understanding how internal system states can become mental states, and in trying to develop a conceptual analysis of this process. However, phenomenology is not enough for a modern theory of mind. Phenomenological, quote, introspective availability under standard conditions, end quote, does not supply us with a satisfactory working concept of the mental because it cannot fixate the sufficient conditions for its application. We all know conscious contents, namely the phenomenal models of distal objects in our environment, i.e., active data structures coded as external objects, the quote, object emulators, end quote, mentioned above, that under standard conditions we never experience as introspectively available. Recent progress in cognitive neuroscience, however, has made it more than a rational assumption that these types of phenomenal contents, as well, are fully determined by internal properties of the brain. All of them will obviously possess a minimally sufficient neural correlate on which they supervene. Chalmers 2000. Many types of hallucinations, agnosia, and neglect clearly demonstrate how narrow and how strict correlations between neural and phenomenal states actually are, and how strong their determination, quote unquote, from below. See the relevant sections in chapters 4 and 7. See also Metzinger 2000a. These data are, as such, independent of any theoretical position one might take toward the mind-body problem in general. For instance, there are perceptual experiences of external objects, the subjective character of which we would never describe as, quote, mental or introspective, end quote, on the level of our pre-reflexive subjective experience. However, scientific research shows that even those states can, under different conditions, become experienced as mental, inner, or introspectively available states. Footnote 17. This can, for instance, be the case in schizophrenia, mania, or during religious experiences. See Chapter 7 for some related case studies. End footnote. This leads to a simple but important conclusion. The process of mental representation, in many cases, generates phenomenal states which are being experienced as mental from the first person perspective, and which are experienced as potential objects of introspection and inward attention. It also generates representata that are being experienced as non-mental and as external states. The kind of attention we direct toward those states is then described as external attention, phenomenologically as well on the level of folk psychology. So mental representation as a process analyzed from a cognitive science third-person perspective does not exclusively lead to mental states which are being experienced as subjective or internal on the phenomenal level of representation. Footnote 18. This thought expresses one of the many possibilities in which a modern, quote unquote, informationalistic theory of mind can integrate and conserve the essential insights of classic idealistic as well as materialistic philosophies of consciousness. In a certain respect, everything, as phenomenally represented in this way, is, quote, within consciousness, end quote. The objective, quote unquote, as well as the, quote, resistance of the world, end quote. However, at the same time, the underlying functions of information processing are exclusively realized by internal physical states. End footnote. Our ontological working hypothesis says that the phenomenal model of reality exclusively supervenes on internal system properties. Therefore, we now have to separate two different meanings of quote unquote introspection and quote unquote subjective. The ambiguities to which I have just pointed are generated by the fact that phenomenal introspection, as well as phenomenal extrospection, is, on the level of functional analysis, a type of representation of the content properties of currently active internal states. In both cases, their content emerges because the system accesses an already active internal representation, a second time, and thereby makes it globally available for attention, cognition, and control of action. It will be helpful to distinguish four different notions of introspection, as there are two types of internal meta representation: a sub-symbolic, attentional kind, which only highlights its object but does not form a mental concept, and a cognitive type, which forms or applies an enduring mental category, quote unquote, or prototype of its object. Footnote 19 from above. Our illusion of the substantiality, the object character, or quote unquote thingness of perceptual objects emerging on the level of subjective consciousness can, under the information processing approach, be explained by the assumption that for certain sets of data, the brain stops iterating its basic representational activity after the first recursive mental representation or self modeling. See chapters 5, 6, and 7. Possess an infinite logical structure which can, in principle, not be realized by finite physical systems. As we'll see in chapter 3, biologically successful representata must never lead a system operating with limited neurocomputational resources into infinite regressions, endless internal loops, and so on, if they do not want to endanger the survival of the system. One possible solution is that the brain has developed a functional architecture which stops iterative but computationally necessary processes like recurrent mental representation and self-modeling by object formations. We find formal analogies for such phenomena in logic, Blau 1986, and in the differentiation between object and meta-language. End footnote. Now, continuing with the chapter, the four notions of introspection. Number one, introspection, quote unquote, external attention. Introspection, subscript 1, is sub-symbolic meta-representation operating on a pre-existing coherent world model. This type of introspection is a phenomenal process of attentionally representing certain aspects of an internal system state, the intentional content of which is constituted by a part of the world depicted as external. The accompanying phenomenology is what we ordinarily describe as attention, or the subjective experience of attending to some object in our environment. Introspection, subscript 1, corresponds to the folk psychological notion of attention. Number 2, introspection, subscript 2, consciously experienced cognitive reference. This second concept refers to a conceptual or quasi-conceptual form of meta-representation operating on a pre-existing coherent model of the world. This kind of introspection is brought about by a process of phenomenally representing cognitive reference to certain aspects of an internal system state, the intentional content of which is constituted by a part of the world depicted as external. Phenomenologically, this class of state is constituted by all experiences of attending to an object in our environment while simultaneously recognizing it or forming a new mental concept of it. It is the conscious experience of cognitive reference. A good example is what Fred Dretske, 1969, called epistemic seeing. Number 3, introspection, subscript 3, inward attention and inward perception. This is a sub-symbolic meta-representation operating on a pre-existing coherent self-model. For the notion of self-model, see Metzinger 1993/1999, 2000 C. This type of introspective experience is generated by processes of phenomenal representation, which direct attention toward certain aspects of an internal system state, the intentional content of which is being constituted by a part of the world depicted as internal. The phenomenology of this class of states is what in everyday life we call inward directed attention. On the level of philosophical theory, It is this kind of phenomenally experienced introspection that underlies classical theories of inner perception, for example, in John Locke or Franz Brentano. See Guzeldi der 1995 for a recent critical discussion. Number 4, introspection subscript 4, consciously experienced cognitive self-reference. This type of introspection is a conceptual or quasi-conceptual kind of meta-representation, again operating on a pre-existing coherent self-model. Phenomenal representational processes of this type generate conceptual forms of self-knowledge by directing cognitive processes towards certain aspects of internal system states, the intentional content of which is being constituted by a part of the world depicted as internal. The general phenomenology associated with this type of representational activity includes all situations in which we consciously think about ourselves as ourselves, i.e., we think what some philosophers call I thoughts. For example, see Baker 1998 and section 6.4.4. On a theoretical level, this last type of introspective experience clearly constitutes the case in which philosophers of mind have traditionally been most interested, the phenomenon of cognitive self-reference, as exhibited in reflexive self-consciousness. Obviously, the first two notions of introspection, respectively, introspective availability, are rather trivial because they define the internality of potential objects of introspection entirely by means of a simple physical concept of internality. In the present context, internality as phenomenally experienced is of greater relevance. We now have a clearer understanding of what it means to define phenomenal states as making information globally available for a system, in particular of the notion of attentional availability. It is interesting to note how this simple conceptual categorization already throws light on the issue of what it actually means to say that conscious experience is a subjective process. What does it mean to say that conscious experience is subjective experience? It is interesting to note how the step just taken helps us to keep apart a number of possible answers to the question of what actually constitutes the subjectivity of subjective experience. Let us here construe subjectivity as a property not of representational content, but of information. First, there is a rather trivial understanding of subjectivity, amounting to the fact that information has been integrated into an exclusively internal model of reality, active within an individual system, and therefore giving this particular system a kind of privileged introspective access to this information in terms of uniquely direct causal links between this information and higher order attentional or cognitive processes operating on it. Call this, quote, functional subjectivity, end quote. A much more relevant notion is, quote unquote, phenomenal subjectivity. Phenomenally subjective information has the property of being integrated into the system's current conscious self-representation. Therefore, it contributes to the content of its self-consciousness. Of course, phenomenally subjective information creates new functional properties as well, for instance, by making system-related information available to a whole range of processes, not only for attention, but also for motor control or autobiographical memory. In any case, introspection subscript 3 and introspection subscript 4 are those representational processes making information phenomenally subjective. For more detailed analysis, see sections 3.2.6 and 6.5. Given the distinctions introduced above, one can easily see that there is a third interpretation of the subjectivity of the subjectivity of conscious experience, flowing naturally from what has just been said. This is epistemic subjectivity, corresponding to the different functional modes of presentation in which information can be available within an individual system. There are types of epistemic access, types of knowledge about world and self accompanying the process of conscious experience. For instance, information can be subjective by contributing to non-conceptual or to conceptual knowledge. In the first case, we have epistemic access generated by introspection subscript 1 and introspection subscript 3. functional and phenomenal ways in which information is attentionally available through the process of subsymbolic resource allocation described above. Cognitive availability seems to generate a much stronger kind of knowledge. Under the third epistemological reading, subjectivity only is a property of precisely that subset of information within the system which directly contributes to consciously experienced processes of conceptual reference and self-reference, corresponding to the functional and the phenomenal processes of introspection subscript 2 and introspection subscript 4. Only information that is in principle categorizable is cognitively available information. See section 2.4.4. After this detour, let us now return to our analysis of the concept of, quote, global availability, end quote. In the way I am developing this concept, it possesses two additional semantic elements. End of section 2.2.1.